We are joined today by my personal friend, Paul McKeever, employment lawyer in Ontario since 1997, leader of the Freedom Party of Ontario for the past 22 years, and now author and philosopher with the publication this year of Judge, Philosophy and Freedom in the First Person. Not a small read. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Robert.
Before we begin, Paul, can we just let our listeners know and our viewers know where they can get your book and in how many formats?
Sure. Robert, you've just shown the audience that the book that's available on Amazon.com or Amazon.ca or wherever your Amazon is. You have different countries. It's available around the world. You can also get it on Amazon in the Kindle format. I don't know if you can see that with there you go. And it's available also in Audible formats on audible.com exclusively. If you have a Kobo reader, you can get it in Kobo. And if you have an Apple app that you want to read books on, you can get the book from Apple as well in the digital
I've,
version.
yes, I've listened to, I started reading this and got some way through, but I found your Audible version excellent. You have an excellent narration voice and it's very listenable and very helpful in getting through the book as well. It's
Thank
almost
you.
like reading Shakespeare. When you read Shakespeare, it's very hard to understand, but when you have somebody talking Shakespeare or playing it, it becomes very much more engaging and understandable.
Yeah, I mean, as
So,
difficult as audiobooks can be for some people, what I found was interesting about my experience in listening to it after I've recorded it is that the Audible experience allows the narrator to just sort of break up the sentences that can otherwise be rather monotonous in the older philosophical texts, put the emphasis on the right syllable, as they say, and make sure that the reader has a good idea of what some 400-year-old writer or 2,000-year-old writer was meaning by what they wrote.
now I must say to the audience that this is a valuable book, and I mean that in a couple of ways. It is not an inexpensive book to buy. It is a philosophic book, and it is a large book, so you will see that reflected in the price. Um,
Incidentally, I should just
yes,
say, to that point, it's a very interesting process when you become an author on what they call Kindle Direct Publishing, KDP. There are certain fixed minimums. So the production cost of the book alone, believe it or not, this book costs Amazon $70 per copy just to produce. And they want to make some money on top of that. So they have their production cost, then they've got their profit margin, and then there's whatever you have above that. So I don't make anywhere near the cost of the book. Yeah.
and it's I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that some of your illustrations are in full color, and I understand that the whole book has to be reflected in that full color process, and that brings up the price as well.
That's true. And in fact, I'm currently working on providing a lower cost version of the full book, black and white, newsprint instead of this. This was high quality paper. It was 12-point type. I might be reducing that to a 10-point type, which for younger readers is probably fine. For older readers, I thought would be too much. So that's why we got the 12-point type in this version.
I thank you.
Kindle, you can, yeah, and Kindle, you can make it any type you want. So, you
Yeah.
could have 1-inch high letters if you'd like.
Yeah. And behind you right now, you're showing the illustrations that you generated in AI for your publication. Did you want
That's
to talk about those before we get into the meat and bones of the actual book?
right, right. Well, when you're writing something that's as uh, difficult to appreciate at times as philosophy, especially when you're reading these old texts, you want the reader to have a sense, a general gist of what's going on. And you might see a teapot there, or you know, when you're writing a book like this, you want to make it as accessible as possible to the reader who might not necessarily have any background in, say, philosophy. And so I was thinking that each chapter really should start with an image that sort of captures or at least gives the sense of, connotes the topic at hand. So we have a little girl entering the Thames River. Well, that's because, you can enter a river, but can you ever enter it again, the same river twice? And we have a magician. Well, what's the magician doing? He's turning a clock into a rabbit or a rabbit into a clock. Would we ever believe that? No. But what if he turned a workable clock into a non-workable clock? Would we think that he did a switcheroo, or would we be more prone to believing that he did something to one clock as opposed to replacing a clock with another clock? Adults would say he's replaced the rabbit with the clock in some sleight of hand way. But adults might be willing to go as far as saying he magically touched the clock and made it stop because the change is relatively small. So,
Yeah,
in a chapter that's going to involve that question, having that magician appear at the beginning of the chapter can be helpful.
right. Now, into the book itself, you call it a dissertation rather than a book, which is fine by me. But it solves the age-old problems of philosophy. Now, what we're about to say for the next while may not be for everybody who's not, read in philosophy. I don't consider myself a philosopher. I would consider you to be a philosopher now that you have this established work under your belt. But in a sense, I mean, Ayn Rand said it herself, philosophy, who needs it, right? Am I right? Who needs it? But the thing is that everybody needs it, and everybody has a philosophy. If you got up out of bed this morning, you have a philosophy, whether you want to call it in that word or not. Now, this book takes some of these age-old problems going all the way back to, Plato, Aristotle, through the Enlightenment, Descartes on up, Hume, and other philosophers from the era of the Enlightenment, and points out some of their problems that have yet to really have been resolved to any satisfying degree. And I think that after a person has read your book, they can lay a good rock solid foundation for understanding that abstract and often misunderstood concept of freedom, which is what this book is really about when it comes to the end of it. It is laying a foundation to understand that political abstract concept of freedom. Would you agree with that sort of bird's eye view of your work, Paul?
Absolutely. And just back to the question of who's a philosopher and everyone's a philosopher, I agree entirely. And an inside bit of information about this book, I refrained from calling anybody a philosopher. And whenever I introduced a new character from history, I referred to what they did for a living, not that we now consider them a philosopher. So Descartes was a soldier. There was another gentleman in the 20th century who was an MI6 agent. There have been physicians like John Locke. There have been lawyers like Jeremy Bentham. So I refer to them by their trade. And I think that's important to understand because whatever your trade or whatever your profession, whether you're a professor or a guy like I used to work on the back of a garbage truck when I was, going through university. That's how I made my way through. No matter what your background, you are a philosopher. The only question is how well you know your own philosophy and how much you want to correct it. Um, this book can be read by anybody. That's why it goes to the extent it does in giving people the nature of the problem and the history of all the bad answers that have been given and why they remain problems today, or rather did until you've read this book and then you know how to solve these 12 problems ultimately.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What I enjoyed about the book is that, yes, you make it readable for the general public by its very structure, which is to, um, with every part of the book, you begin by, you're a lawyer, so this comes naturally to you. You begin by presenting a case wherein the reader oversees the case as the judge. And then you introduce the problem that has to really be solved in order to properly adjudicate the case fairly and accurately with regard to truth and a reason. So, and then at the end of it, you give the reader, I guess, your judgment based on what you've presented as the problem philosophically and the solution from what you call the first person solution or perspective. And so that it frames an issue in a court case, it solves the issue, and that's important because I think that people don't want to be left hanging as to what the solution is to these problems. You offer the solutions and then you give it a real world example in a court case. These are fictitious cases, but
Yeah.
still, and you can see that from the names that you came up with for the defendants and the appellants. It's just look for the Easter eggs in those names. That's all I can say.
Yeah, there are a lot of Easter eggs. There is a red stapler in there for anyone who's a fan of
The
Office
Office.
Space. And yeah, was it called The Office or Office Space?
Oh,
I think.
Office Space. No, you're
Office
right. I was
Space.
thinking of Gervais. Yeah.
But interestingly, as much as these are fictitious, cases, several of them are inspired by actual and real cases, including one, a Canadian case, in which a person who was a somnambulist, in other words, he was a sleepwalker, did some very difficult things. He got out of bed, he drove down the road, and he murdered somebody, and then he sort of woke up and realized he'd done it. And the question is, how could anyone who's asleep go through all of that very complex maneuvering, kill somebody, and then claim that they weren't responsible because they were asleep at the time? So I did a derivative case, add a little bit of comedy with the red stapler, and show how that relates to some philosophical problem. And you're right. The point of this exercise, and including these court cases, these are very concrete cases. I'll give you an example. When you're driving in Ontario, or I think in your province, in New Brunswick, the street lights, red, amber, green, with the red at the top, green at the bottom. But in some provinces, I think BC, you can see them side by side. So if you're a gentleman who's red, green colorblind, and you suddenly find yourself driving down the street and there's a sideways light, and you can't tell the difference between red and green, you might say, well, is that a go or a stop? And that's exactly what happens to Mr. Gray in my book. Okay. He runs into Missy Fortune at the at the corner of two streets, which together would suggest philosophy, love. I think it's Amore Avenue and uh, I can't remember the other street. But in any event, the question there, you say, well, how does this relate at all to to philosophy? And so it turns out that there is a long-standing philosophical problem. And to answer the question of whether this person ran a red light, you have to be able to answer the question, well, what does it mean for something to be red? Is your red the same as my red? Or when we both look at a set of lights like this, do we both see a difference between red and green? Or do you see one and I don't? Um, I won't tell you how the judge decided in that case, but um, it's sometimes infuriating for the reader. I hope that's the whole point, because sometimes the intuitive answer, like, well, you knew he was running a red, come on, isn't actually the right answer. And if you were to take this, you know, job seriously as a judge, you'd have to consider these philosophical problems, problems of perception, problems of when is a thing no longer a thing, when is it something else? Uh, is this really one of those, or actually is it in another category altogether? What do we mean by meaning anyway? Like, are these things out here or are they in here? And does everyone have a different idea for what cat is?
Mhm.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these things have very practical, real world applications. And a lot of the arguments we have every day in politics, even in art, but especially in politics, because that's a very common thing to argue about. A lot of the things we're arguing about have to do with disagreements on a philosophical problem. We've solved the philosophical problem in a different way, or we understand it in a different way. We're willing to write off certain things as not possible to know, or we take things for granted that we shouldn't. And by reading through and identifying, oh my gosh, this argument I've been having with Bob over here is actually it's a long-standing problem called the problem of causation that's been around for hundreds of years. And turns out we've all been looking at it wrongly. But if we both came to the same understanding of what causation was, maybe we wouldn't be arguing about this political question.
That was a very instructive chapter on causation and the nature of the person, and your innovative way to bring it into a first person perspective, I found profound, and I think that I don't know if it's ever been done before, but it certainly, to me, was a groundbreaking way of looking at things. Has it been treated before in that manner?
It um, not the perspective idea. So I did a lot of work. You can imagine, I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm not a professor of philosophy. And I know that if I write a book on anything that I'm not an expert in by training, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny or just a lot of ignoring, which is why you'll find in this book, A, it's long. And that's because I'm giving the background necessary to know. I'm quoting the actual philosophers who identified the problems, who gave the wrong solutions, et cetera. I give the citations. In fact, if you buy the Kindle version, okay, the Kindle version allows you to actually click on a source and it'll take you on the internet to the free copy of that book, whether it's Aristotle or Plato or whatever, which unfortunately we can't do with paper copies. But yeah, you really, as a person who's not got credentials, who's not a professor of philosophy, you need to be able to show that you know what you're talking about, which is why I went into depth on this. So you can imagine I'm sitting doing my research and saying, I've just got this brainwave on this, how to solve this problem. Oh, come on. Someone's clearly come up with this before. The problem's been around for 2,000 years. Surely someone's done this. And what was fascinating over and over and over again was finding out that no, they haven't come up with this solution. But what was more fascinating was realizing why. And it was that for each of these 12 problems, philosophers have been using what I call the third person perspective. Third person would be, for example, if you take a dog and a cat and you say the dog is sitting beside the cat, well, you need to be able to look at two things at the same time.
In
The,
relation to each other as well.
the relation between them, that's right. The dog is beside the cat, yes or no. The dog is above the cat, you know, etc. These are relations between two what I call entities in the book. And what has happened, what has confused philosophy for all these centuries, in fact, for millennia, with respect to some of these problems, is they have taken what should be a question about the identity of one entity, like a dog, just look at the dog, and treated it as a question of relation. So, to take a simple example, a dog is a thing that wears a collar. We can all agree that dogs wear collars, but is a collar a part or property of a dog? No. If you were to look at the identity of that dog, the question of what the dog is, you wouldn't say, well, the dog is a thing that wears a collar, because a collar is a separate entity. And so what has happened throughout history and philosophy, the history of philosophy, is philosophers have looked at certain problems as relations, questions of relation between two or more entities, when they should have been looking from the perspective of one entity and considering the problem in that way. So that's what I've done. In each of the 12 chapters, I've shown how philosophers have erred, why I can detect that they must have been using the third person perspective. And then I show what happens when you apply the first person perspective and how it resolves the difficulty, because the difficulty, whether we call it a dilemma or a paradox, what we're really referring to is misapplications of perspective, looking at a problem from the wrong perspective and therefore not being able to figure out, why can I not solve this?
There's some of these things that when you get to your first person solution, you have a eureka moment or an epiphany that, oh, like, why didn't I think of it this way? Because now it sort of resolves itself. It's easy to see when somebody else gives you the solution that that's how you should have been thinking about it all the time. Now,
Yeah.
you were saying that what I call identity, and I should say it for the people who read your book that you begin by defining your terms in great detail, because
Painful detail.
part. Hmm?
Painful detail, one might say.
Yes, and there's a reason for that, in that a lot of the problems that philosophers have had is that they're talking cross purposes. They're talking what one person may mean by identity, another person may mean slightly different, and that's where the problems arise. And also, a word can have many different meanings. And you define your use of that word and put it in all caps, which is not expressed or not easily expressed in Audible, but you do mention in Audible that you are using that word by saying all caps. So to remind the reader that you should not misconstrue the meaning of this word that I am defining at the beginning of the book with something else that somebody else may have defined it as.
Right.
So Ayn Rand said in her philosophy, define your terms. You do so right at the beginning. And I think that that will um, allay anybody's criticism or put aside anybody's criticism that they may have because, oh, you say this and that doesn't mean that. Well, you've defined it perfectly well at the beginning of your book. How much of your effort went into that, Paul? Because that was quite a large part of the introduction to your book.
Well, it's funny. This book was not written in the order that it appears. So it is in a chronological, uh, sorry, well, there is chronology in each chapter, but it's in a hierarchical structure. So I start at the very base of philosophy, which is called metaphysics. In other words, what exists. I move into questions of epistemology. How do I know what is? And that's basically books one and two. Book three is questions of what ought to be. So the first is what is, and the second is what ought. What ought I to do? What ought I to do now that I know what is? And that's morality and politics. So the first chapter I'd written was actually the one on free will. I hadn't thought of writing a book at that point. I was just trying to write an essay on free will, and I came across this notion of the perspective. And I thought, I wonder if I can apply this idea that if I changed from the third person perspective to the first person perspective mentally when I'm thinking about a philosophical problem, how many long-standing philosophical problems can I solve by doing that? That's the result. This book is the result of finding the problems, literally looking for them, the ones that no one's resolved yet. That's what the first step was in each of these chapters. Then finding out what others had said about those problems, why they kept chasing their tail, and then applying the first person perspective to give the solution. So having started with free will, you can imagine there was a bit of back and forth where I'd say, okay, what comes before free will? Oh, looks like um, the problem of induction. Well, what comes before the problem of induction? Well, the problem of causation. So if you're working your way back and every time you think you've got right to the bottom of things, you say, wait a minute, no, I haven't gotten to the bottom of things. There's something I have to explain before they can understand this problem, like the problem of causation. So one day I'm sitting there and I'm thinking I've got it all done. I've done the chapter on I think it was on perception. And my son, who was much younger at the time, said, because this is written over 10 years, you have to understand, this is a 10-year project. My son said to me, but Daddy, where does one thing end and the other begin? And I realized that his little problem, his little question, was super fundamental to the entire book. And I had to write then a chapter on what is an entity, of what is it comprised, and what makes thing not one entity not part of another entity. Um, so that son of a gun of a son of mine made it necessary for me to be very rigorous in defining my terms and in identifying what is an entity, what is its identity, and how does that differ. And a lot of it is complementary to what, say, Ayn Rand would say. But I'm very careful in this book not to say that this is a book of objectivism. It's not an objectivism book. This is a philosophy book. But what's, I think, most useful to people who read Ayn Rand's philosophy, this book will do the one thing that Ayn Rand didn't care to do. You just showed us all a copy of Philosophy Who Needs It. And in the first chapter of that book, she's giving an address to the graduates of West Point, and there's audio of it you could listen to online. But at one point, she says, you might ask me, Ms. Rand, why should I bother reading philosophy? All these philosophers were wrong. It's all a bunch of nonsense. And she responds, it is nonsense, but you don't know it's nonsense. And only by reading the philosophy can you know what you're talking about. It's one thing to assert that Kant was wrong or that Hegel was wrong or etc. But unless you've read Kant, Hegel, Hume, whatever, and identified what exactly they said that you're taking so much objection to, you really probably should turn that part off, because it turns out that although Ayn Rand responded quite well to many bad philosophical ideas, she didn't set out to teach people the history of philosophy or what even she was responding to. She gave some pretty good answers in terms of philosophy without necessarily showing what were the bad answers that she was trying to cancel out. So this book, if you want to understand where Ayn Rand was coming from and why she says something is right in her philosophy, uh, I guarantee if you read this book, you will be the best objectivist you'll ever meet
So
because you'll know what she was doing. Um, that isn't to say that every solution or any solution in this book is one of hers. I'll give you one, though, that I would say is definitely hers, and that is the causation chapter. Ayn Rand had said that an entity's identity is the cause. Okay, is what we mean when we talk about causation. I agree with that entirely. But what I've done in that chapter is to show, hopefully in a dramatic way, using examples like little dolls with jointed, little jointed figures and etc., how it's absolutely true and not only it is true, but has to be true.
yeah, I particularly like that chapter, and your examples are many, and they get across the point very well. So, when Rand, I remember reading that Rand sort of skimmed a lot of philosophers in when she discovered at the beginning that they were wrong fundamentally on something. So she sort of made the conclusion, therefore, that why should I read the rest of this? If his fundamentals are wrong, his subsequent ideas have to be wrong. Or if they aren't wrong, it was just a fluke, that they may be right. So she dismissed a lot of philosophers who, in her estimation, were fundamentally wrong. And I have to ask the question after reading, I have not finished the book, by the way, but after reading what I have read, and I've read over half of it, that it would be easy for a reader to dismiss a lot of philosophers like, oh, why should I read Hume? He was so wrong about these things, right? Why should I read him? Or Kant? And, and now that you've effectively destroyed the work of many of these philosophers in a number of areas, I was left with this odd feeling like, should we dismiss them for their errors or should we try to understand these people in the context of their time and their thought processes which led to their conclusions, because their conclusions often led to monumental changes, both political and cultural, in the world, often with disastrous results. So, if we want to know, as Leonard Peikoff did in The Ominous Parallels, what led up to the Third Reich, what led up to Weimar Republic Germany, he went into the philosophy of Immanuel Kant.
Yep.
Right? So we have to if anybody's serious about understanding politics and culture and freedom, we really can't dismiss these people out of hand, even though we know that they are incorrect. We have to understand them because they influence the intellectuals influence the culture influence the politics, which is downstream from culture. So, yes, reading Kant will tell you perhaps why Hitler annexed the Sudetenland, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you can get rid of Kant and you can get rid of Hume and you can get rid of anybody you want in history, but there'll just be another person who comes along spouting the exact same conclusions with or without as much rigor in their thinking. So if you take there's one thing you cannot say about Kant and Hume and et cetera, and that they were lazy. They were not lazy and they were very thorough. They were making mistakes and they built upon their mistakes, Hume in particular. I would say Hume, more than any other philosopher I've read, contributed to these 12 problems that are in the book, you know, because he compounded one error on top of the next. And starting at something as simple as perception. And that's why you really have to start at the bottom of philosophy and work up, because if you want to try and solve a problem that was 10 problems down the line, in Hume's own work, you have to go to the first problem in the line because that's the one that caused the ripple effect. Um, the other thing was, I know that Ayn Rand, you were talking about Ayn Rand, and the one example I can think of that applies to what you just said was John Rawls, The Theory of Justice. And she said she says in her review of that book, I have not read the whole book, nor do I intend to. But I think that's because actually there was nothing really novel in that book. Not really, not fundamentally novel. And I think she knew that from the get-go. This is a rehash of of morality that's thousands of years old. You know, it's just collectivism and envy. And she knew all about that. So he had put it into a book probably about the size of my book. But if you want to pick up that book and read it, there's very little you need to read because his essential argument is set out in very few pages. The rest are just attempted defenses of the principle.
So
And
this would be a companion to anybody who's an objectivist. This should be on your shelf as a companion piece to the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Not a replacement. You know, it acknowledges her contributions, but it fleshes out what she either didn't have the time for or was uninterested in doing, which is the problems that she tried to solve as well.
yeah, and now I don't want to pass this off as a an Ayn Rand book. It's not. It's just that I had long-standing exposure to Ayn Rand's work that precedes any other philosophy that I'd read. I've for decades propounded uh, freedom, individual freedom, the life, liberty, and property that she did as well. So she holds a high rank in my intellectual history. But there's no, there's no two ways of putting it. If you read this book, you will have a more profound understanding of her arguments and a greater ability to defend those arguments than you ever would have dreamed of having had you not read the book. So in that sense, yes, it's a companion.
I just mentioned that all of these dead philosophers, their consequences were, at least in most part, disastrous wars, death, famine, destruction, suicides. You know, it's just unbelievable if you put an idea in a person's head and he runs with it, what can happen. Conversely to that, it is because of some of these philosophers that we have the United States of America, the Declaration of Independence, and a constitutional republic down there, which has so far stood the test of time. If Ben Franklin were alive, I hope that he would say that you've kept it so far. Um, After he left the conference where they created the republic, he was asked, by a lady on the street, Mr. Franklin, what did you create? A republic if you can keep it.
Right.
This is because of the philosophers who influenced the men who created the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They were all very well read, well traveled in most cases, um, and they knew the philosophers. They knew the Enlightenment, and that's a direct result, and it's a positive result. So philosophy, who needs it? You do. Everybody does. You
Yeah,
need to understand that it is so important. Ideas matter, right?
absolutely. And take, for example, John Locke, who figures, largely in several parts of my book. He had come up with this idea of the law of nature, which he said was reason, and he talked about what is right, and he spoke about life, liberty, and property, and the defense of it, and the role of government in defending it. Interestingly, he's given too much credit when it comes to the origin of the concept of rights, plural, as individual things, like the right of life, the right of liberty, the right of property. And when you realize that he was a huge inspiration to Jefferson, but that he was not the originator of rights as individual things, you get to understand just how important Jefferson's thought alone was. Jefferson isn't necessarily held up as one of the great philosophers, but as an influential writer, a lawyer, in point of fact, um, he's obviously one having, some of the greatest impact, especially to Western history. That idea of rights of life, liberty, and property as endowments from God, we can argue with that, but the idea of rights, that's a Jeffersonian concept, not a Lockean one. And it really points to the importance of America as well in the history of philosophy.
We often talk, you and I and Freedom Party, about libertarianism, for example, and say that Ayn Rand, by the way, did not like libertarianism because she said it was unfounded. And by that, she meant that They took abstract concepts like freedom, individual freedom, capitalism, and that an activity of the individual without a philosophic fundamental foundation upon which to show and demonstrate that this is why we want to support individual freedom. So, how important would you say that understanding the fundamental branches of philosophy, that being metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, are to understand, at least fully understand, the more popular branch of philosophy, which is politics?
Well, let's look a little bit at that branch. So politics and or ethics even, but politics and ethics, in other words, what one ought to do. The problems that you find in philosophy with respect to those kinds of with respect to those fields are different in kind than the ones that you find in metaphysics and epistemology, which is why I called books, book two, The Paradoxes of Is, but called book three, The Dilemmas of Ought, because dilemmas and paradoxes are two different things. And dilemmas being, should we go this way or should we go that way? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Sometimes the phrase gets used like that. But um, the disagreements among philosophers with respect to moral and political arguments or problems are of a different kind. Usually, for morals and for politics, the philosophers are simply giving different definitions to the same word over and over again, whether it's justice or rights or right or freedom, each of which is a separate chapter in my book. You'll see a repetition of the exercise. Someone takes the well-regarded word, justice, freedom, right, and then they graft onto it their own definition, which can be 180 degrees in opposition to what someone else is using.
Social justice, animal
Exactly.
rights.
Exactly right. And that normally is the way it goes. The good name comes first, justice. Then someone wants to create the opposite of justice, but sell it as something good. So rather than give a different word to it, like injustice or evil, they give it an adjective, as you say, social justice, which just means not justice, right? And so the problems, let's take, for example, freedom, okay, which is the last chapter in my book. And you're right, the chapters build, and without those prior 12 chapters, there would be no way you could simply just agree with Paul McKeever on the nature of freedom, which is what the chapter's about. Freedom is autonomy is the name of the chapter. Well, says Paul McKeever, I think it's this other thing. I think it's freedom from want. It's freedom from need. It's freedom from hunger,
The
freedom from,
four freedoms.
yeah, the four freedoms are discussed. That's right. As a political contrivance that was actually designed to get America more involved in world affairs. And the idea was that unless we have around the world freedom from hunger, freedom from, et cetera, then we will end up having our own Hitlers right here in the United States of America. And so it was a way of responding to policy in the United States, which some would call insular or isolationism or whatever you want to call it, where you put America first. Does that sound familiar? Right. And you don't care as much about what's going on in other parts of the world. That's their problem. Well, if you're a big businessman or a banker, the rest of the world holds great promise, great riches. If we can only just get involved over there, but our government is saying America first, close the borders. Things must just happen in this country. If you want to make cars, you make them in this country for this country. Wouldn't it be great though if we could make cars for Japan and England and Africa? Wouldn't it? We could make so much more money. Hey, President, how about a speech in which you let's talk about freedom. We won't talk about money. We'll talk about freedom. And we'll talk about the freedom to be free of need. Let's have freedom from need. How about that? There's a concept. I need nothing because I have everything. How will it happen? Government policy. Okay.
Yeah. There's some
Right.
people. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Well, so why should anybody say, well, that is freedom McKeever's autonomy is not freedom, or McKeever's freedom is freedom, and the welfare statism version is not freedom. If it's just this is the one I like, that's not a basis for choosing a nature of freedom. To understand the nature of freedom, you need to build it upon the concepts that are prior to it. You know, freedom. Okay, well, what is right, or what are rights, depending on, and should there be rights plural, or is there right as in doing the right thing? Well, okay, but to know what's right, don't we have to know what justice is, which is prior? Well, justice for whom? Is it social justice? Is it, John Rawls, and he comes up in the justice chapter as talking about social justice. How do you fight a guy who says that, well, to know what justice is, what we ought to do is imagine that we aren't born yet. We're just like little souls with no identity. And we know that when we get born into the world, we might get born into a rich family or a poor family. We might be smart, we might be dumb, we might be strong, we might be weak, we might be male, female, black, white, etc. So, if that was the situation we were in, we couldn't know anything about ourselves yet, what sort of social system would we want? What would we call the just social system? Oh, it would be the one that redistributes wealth so that everybody ends up in the same spot. Equity, not equality. All right. And so, how do you fight that? Well, you first have to know that it exists by reading it. You might even not believe that it exists as an idea until you read it as a quotation. But then you have to put it in the context of everything that came before justice. In other words, how do we know what is? You know, what is? Well, how do we know what is? Those are questions of is, not of ought. So before we can even answer who's right about rights, John Rawls or Thomas Jefferson, we need to know who's right about, you know, induction, causation, identity. These things are all implied in every answer that someone might have about the nature of justice. They're making assumptions about identity. They're making, for example, are you an individual human being, or are we all just part of a large collective? Call it Borg, call it the existence of all matter. Are we all just part of the environment? Should we be considered as individual things or not? Well, you can make it a much easier case for social welfare if we're all in this together, or we're not really individual in any meaningful way. And the only way to get at that concept of individuality is something way prior to the question of justice.
Drew, this is something that what was going through my mind when I was reading this was the meticulous way that you defined things and then applied it to, I'm applying it to politics when I hear, say, for example, uh, Kamala Harris say something or Justin Trudeau say something, and it's people are calling it a word salad, right? This brought up something, a memory of me interviewing law professor Bruce Pardy
Mhm.
about the notwithstanding clause and the first article in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which says effectively that you have these rights as long as we say you do, free and demonstrably justified in a free society. And then Brian Peckford, during the Freedom Convoy, Brian Peckford, of course, being instrumental in the creation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the only living person left who had influence in that decision making, he said that Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms means this. We meant insurrection. We meant rioting, overrunning Parliament. We meant world war. We meant, going to war with somebody. And Bruce Pardy, very succinctly, being a law professor, said, that's not what it says. Words have meanings. So
Yeah,
whatever your intent was as a politician, it is irrelevant to the law because the law looks at what is written, what has
right.
passed. So fascinating to be able to read your book and ponder about the importance of words and definitions. What do we mean by free will? Free, what does that mean? Will, what is it? What is will? What is soul? What is determinism? Does determinism mean that there's a determiner? These things, if you get into the nitty gritty of every single word that a philosopher may have pontificated about, hundreds of years ago, you can see why a lot of it evolved into the conundrums and the problems that we have in today's education system.
Yeah.
When you have the kids going out there talking about social justice, just excuse me, what do you mean by that? Social? What does social mean? Society? Point to society. Where is it? Justice? What does that mean? If you press people on the street who are shouting platitudes from the river to the sea, what river? What sea? I don't know. You
Yeah.
you find that society, if it exists, these people, these individuals, are so lacking in the fundamentals of understanding that to give them a problem in politics, which is a high order abstraction, thought process, freedom, justice, liberty, you know, um, they can't grasp it. Their minds have been so muddled up with the thoughts of all these philosophers and the educators who follow these philosophers. For example, Karl Marx, and take those words and destroy words, deliberately destroy words. What do you mean by case? What do you mean by, in a medical sense? Or what do you mean by justice or rights, especially rights? What is a right? Man, your book gives a person a lot of food for thought, and I thank you for it.
Thank you. I mean, it was a pleasure writing it in the sense that it was a learning exercise. You know, they say teachers, they learn the best by preparing the lessons that they're going to give to their students. That's certainly my experience. I started with a blank slate on a given problem, learned the problem, read the quotation, well, not the quotations, I read the books, and pulled out the quotations that were most needed to make the point, and then applied, this idea I had about perspective to each of those problems. And that wasn't just a matter of, oh, well, since I know this thing about perspective, I can easily solve every problem. It was not an overnight thing. An average chapter of this book took the better part of a year to write. And there were times at which I'd written, I think the perception chapter I had to write twice because after writing it, I think it took 6 months to write the first.
Didn't look right to you?
I noticed some, I don't even
That's
remember
a
what
that's a
glaring
joke.
error. Yeah, I perceived a problem. I sensed something was wrong. Um, yeah, no, I had to rewrite it because I realized I was completely in error. So yeah, it's a struggle, but for someone who's reading it, the only struggle is going to be, you know, uh, comprehension rather than having to reinvent the wheel. Hopefully, I've given you 12 good wheels to comprehend.
We spoke earlier before we sat down to do this video a couple of days ago, and I asked you, of all those problems, what are the ones that you would like people to understand or get a better understanding of from your book? And you said perspective and relation and identity. So, what is so important about the problems associated with these concepts that you felt driven to untangle that Gordian knot which previous philosophers tied themselves up into trying to understand? So, perspective and relation and identity. What about
Sure.
those?
Okay, so perspective. You're sitting down to think about anything. And let's think about, and there's a teapot image somewhere in here that's going to be flying by. Think about a teapot. You can stand back, put it on the table, have a look at it. You could say, well, there is its handle. There's a little teapot. You know the song. And it's actually, I'm using that as an example in the book. There's a little teapot, short and stout. There is its handle. There is its spout. Okay. That is a third person perspective. You're standing out here and you're looking over there. Already, you bear a relation to it. You're one entity, it's another. And that will cloud your thinking about what the identity of that teapot is. What is its identity? For example, you might say, that teapot is the thing that is always on my countertop. That teapot is often in my hand. That's what makes it my teapot. Husband and wife. What is a wife? She's the person who always walks beside me. Okay, so is that part of her identity that she walks beside you? Not from the first person perspective, it isn't. You'd have to look at both the husband and the wife in order to say, there's a relation between them, and to attribute to the wife or to the husband that relation. Here's another example. Bob always smokes a pipe. What is Bob's identity? Is the pipe part of his identity? No. Why not? Well, from the first person perspective, all we can consider is Bob. And that pipe is not a part or a property of Bob. Bob's nature, what Bob is always comprised of two things, his parts and his properties. A part would be things like he has two arms, two legs. A property would be something like he can move his hand like this. Or he's got a pinkish shoe. So if we take away from all consideration everything other than the one entity we want to understand the identity of, we can avoid making mistakes such as, you know, who is Bob? He's a member of the community. He's a part of the collective. He's a Christian. He's a those are all relations to other people, to organizations, etc. They are not part of Bob's identity properly.
And they can change over time.
Yeah, yeah.
Mind you, the body changes over time and your mind changes over time as well.
Well, yeah, and well, let's talk about that then. Change. It's the first problem addressed in the book. You know that there's an old problem. The book or the ship of Theseus. So it's a wooden ship, and it's got these planks and nails, and all the various parts of a ship. And over time, this gets rotted, that gets damaged, nails get replaced, and etc. And after say 50, 100 years, none of the pieces of the ship of Theseus are pieces of the original ship of Theseus. And you say, is this still the ship of Theseus? None of the parts are the same. All of the matter of which this boat is made is new. It has none of it appeared in the original ship. Now, there were two main philosophers who dealt with this issue of change versus identity, Heraclitus and Parmenides. And Heraclitus said, because things are constantly changing, nothing ever really has an identity. You can't say that, Bob has two arms because eventually he might have one arm, or he's this tall, but over time he's shrinking because he's getting older. Therefore, you really can't say Bob is ever Bob. There is no Bob. There's only constant change of matter in the universe. Parmenides took the opposite view. He said, no, there's no change. Change is an illusion. So the first guy, Heraclitus, he's saying identity is an illusion. You just think that things have an identity. You think there are individual entities. Parmenides says, no, that's not the mistake that's being made. You're deluding yourself into believing that change exists. There is no change. And he had his own reasons. Along came Aristotle, and he said, well, there's a thing called hylomorphism. Something can have the same matter but different form. We take some clay, same clay, but now we make it into an elephant, and now we make it into a car, and now we make it into a baseball. So something can have the same matter but different form. Or we can make the same form out of different matter. We can make it out of clay or out of paper mache or what have you, but it's still the same form. It's still a ball, let's say. That has its problems, which we need not get into. The answer for me was, from the first person perspective, let's say that you are a person with 1 million hairs on your head. At this point in time, you have 1 million hairs on your head. And then sitting in front of me is you, but this person sitting in front of me has fewer than 1 million hairs because one fell out. Did you change from a person with 1 million hairs to a person with fewer hairs? Are you still you, but with fewer hairs? Did you change? My answer is no, you did not change. You were replaced. You were literally replaced because the thing that comprises the man with fewer than 1 million hairs is not the thing that is comprised of 1 million hairs. Those are two separate entities. Separate in the sense that they are not the same. Right?
Identical.
They are not identical. And anytime something exists that is not identical to something that used to exist that no longer exists, if it's not identical, it's because one thing has been replaced with the other. The clock that functioned a spring goes kapring, doesn't work anymore. The functioning clock is not the non-functioning clock. And they don't coexist, right? One, the functioning clock no longer exists as a functioning clock. There's now in its place a non-functioning clock. The man with a million hairs doesn't exist anymore. The man with 999,999 hairs exists. The latter guy replaced the former guy. Now, this might sound absurd. It's not like poof, one guy disappears and another one's invented and put in his place. But mentally and physically, like independently of your own understanding of anything, something with a million hairs is not, by any stretch of the imagination, something that has fewer than a million hairs. It's just not the same thing. And they don't coexist. So you are replaced constantly over the course of your life. There is never one Paul McKeever. There's no one Robert Vaughn. There is a sequence of entities that we give a single identity to. The identity, your identity, is in my head. It's in your daughter's head. It's in your wife's head. Each of us has an identity for you. And because it's an identity, not an entity, it's not made of parts and properties. It's made of attributes that we identify in you. Robert has light skin. Robert has the voice that sounds like this, etc.
Has less than a million hairs.
Has less than a million hairs. We can decide to treat you as the same Robert. So we give continuity to Roberts as one entity, not because Robert really is one entity. Robert is a sequence of entities, but we treat them for our purposes as being one entity. And we do that with the mentally produced identity that we attribute to that entity. So Robert is the physical thing. The identity is the collection of attributes that we identify in our heads, that we associate with, in other words, or that pertain to that physical entity. And that is why we get the sense of continuity, that things change over time. It's a incorrect thing. The identity might not change over time, but the entity is replaced over time.
I
And we just,
remember if it was the court case involving that particular problem was the one of a man who killed somebody, but in the killing was lost his memory and
yes.
totally different person from his lawyer's point of view to the court. This is not the same man. How can you judge this man on the actions of the man that preceded this man? So that was a fascinating case too. I won't give away the answer, but I think now that after you just talked about it, I think you'll understand what
Oh, hey,
the
if
solution
people
is.
yeah, if people have followed with us for this long, and maybe they'll, yeah, intuit it. The other thing about that incident or that case, by the way, that scenario that I put in the book, is that that man not only lost his memory, he had a changed personality. He was no longer an angry young man, and he was quadriplegic now. He wasn't capable of repeating the offense. So yeah, you can guess where that all ends up. And there's actually a follow-up scenario in a later chapter where basically a copycat tries to get away with it, and we'll see what happens with him.
Yeah, no, that was also a companion to that particular case made you think even further about the identity or personal identity. And that was fascinating as well. Is there anything you want to finish up with, Paul? Anything we haven't covered?
I'll just say this. At the end of the day, what I wanted to have was a sound foundation, philosophical foundation for my account of what freedom is. Freedom is autonomy, you know. If you can agree that freedom is autonomy, and by autonomy I mean you are the author of what will happen with you and your life and your property. Okay. You get to decide, not the government, not your neighbor.
The first person gets to decide.
The first person, from the first person perspective, the decider is you. And I had to give that justification with the prior 12 chapters, which I think I've done.
You
The
have.
the implications for that, thank you, for that concept of freedom with respect to government are, I think, somewhat, well, they are revolutionary in the sense that they are not the typical objectivist or libertarian, etc., uh, remedies in terms of the role of government. It's not quite the same. It's the same outcome, the same goal to preserve individual freedom. But what I've done is to say we can't just look at the political response to the need for freedom. We can't just think about the role of government in terms of political concepts. We have to think about the metaphysical concepts, the epistemological concepts, the moral concepts, and the political concepts, or else what ends up happening is that we allow our governments to be two-edged swords. Effectively, the very same thing that we can use in defense of freedom, we can use to undermine it. Or rather, put in terms of autonomy, the very things that would allow you to exist as an independent, rational, self-interested, free individual. Um, those principles have to be set in a way that they are not used by government to take away your existence as an individual, as opposed to a member of the collective, not used in a way to take away your ability and to act upon your own rational thoughts, are not used in a way to take away your ability to make decisions that are in your own interest, as opposed to putting your neighbor first, etc. And so that's the goal, to ultimately come up with a concept of freedom that's philosophically well founded and that therefore indicates a different way of looking at the role of government and when it should act and when it should not. I'll give you an example. The typical way that we think about, at least on the freedom side of things, that we think about freedom is we say that the government's role is to defend every individual's rights of life, liberty, and property. So man comes into, I'll just call people black and white for the sake of how people like to talk about people nowadays. White man owns a coffee shop, has a sign on the outside of the coffee shop, and it says, black men not allowed. Black man comes in and said, I'd like to buy a coffee. White man says, we don't serve your kind here. Get out. Black man says, no, with respect, I would like to pay the price you're asking in this public space for a coffee. Now, on the rights argument, what I call the rights argument, the store owner then has a right, because it's his property, it's his freedom to decide, how he wants to exercise his liberty. He has the right to call the police and to say, remove this man from my property. Why? His skin is the wrong color. And I've chosen not to serve people of that color. What have we just done if the police are expected and do come and remove the black man from the store? We've just turned government into the gun that is used to enforce collectivism, enforce racism. And I think that's a mistake. That's not the intention of those who advocate rights. They didn't really want a system that advocates collectivism, that there's black people and there's white people and they form separate collectives. They don't want a system that says people should be making irrational decisions, meaning decisions based on racism, for example. They don't want, what if, for example, the guy says, we only allow communists in here, we don't serve individualists, or, if you want to come in here, you have to dedicate your life to, give half of your income to so-and-so. In other words, you have to engage in some kind of altruistic show before I'll serve you coffee. We have to be careful not to turn the guns of government into things that can be used by collectivists, by irrationalists, by altruists to undermine freedom. And so I've come up with a role of government, a way of defining its role based on freedom as autonomy that gets us out of that rut. In short, the man who says, hey, officer, come on over here, I've got a black man on my property and he won't leave until I serve him a coffee. The role of government is to say, please hang up and call your priest or something like that, because we don't do that in this country. We don't remove people on the basis of color. We don't remove people on the basis of irrational decision making, such as that.
You imply then that they could remove somebody on the basis of a rational decision. And I'll give you one example would be the athletic club curves, which only allows women.
Yeah.
You could argue there's a rational reason for that. And if a man came in and said, I would like to be exercising in front of these women, they could say, no, get out, and we'll enforce it through the law of government. But then there's another decision. This is real life decision where a Muslim barber refuses to cut the hair of a woman. I believe it's an Ontario case too, or at least in Canada, but maybe Ontario. And I'm not sure how that was resolved, but what would your philosophy say to that Muslim man who does not want to cut a woman's hair because, and his reason was it is against his religion to touch another woman who's not his wife or child, right? So what do you say to that?
So I'm not against clubs, exclusive clubs. That's fine. But in a situation where you say this is a public, like a service offered to the public at large, you've chosen to make it open to the public at large, and therefore she's a member of the public. You cut her hair.
Ah, so if he put a sign up, see, I'm the devil's advocate here. If he
Yeah,
put a sign up in the when men's hairstyling,
yeah,
we only serve men, would that satisfy the irrational decision of him to not touch another woman other than his
sure.
wife?
And yeah, and I give the example of you hear about the gay cakes, uh,
Yes, bake the cake.
bake
Yeah.
the cake. And so in my book, I give the example of that. To Now I don't use males or females. I use Pat and Bev or something like that. So it doesn't really matter, in other words. But a gay couple comes in and they say, we're getting married and we'd like you to make us a rainbow. Have you ever seen the rainbow colored um, layer cakes? We want a rainbow cake and we want, two males or two females on top. And he says, sorry, I don't make those. Get out of my shop. Well, we'd like to buy just a generic wedding cake off the shelf then. No, I don't serve gay people. Well, this was not a shop that said straight people's club for cake. I mean, I don't even think you could operate a thing like a cake club. But anyway, um, um, uh, there, the answer is it's open to the public, but he doesn't make those things, cakes that are, you know, rainbow cakes or whatever. He can't be forced to make that which he doesn't offer to the public generally. But he must sell to the public that which he offers to the public. So the generic cake, yes. Can he be forced to make a rainbow cake that he never makes? No.
What if he can make the cake? We're getting down the rabbit hole here.
Yeah, yeah,
What if
yeah,
he
of course.
can make the cake? It's physically possible for him to put two grooms, for example, on top of a rainbow cake, which he can make.
Yeah.
No problem for him to make it, but because of his irrational feelings toward the couple, he just chooses not to, even though he's open to the public at large.
I think he's fine. I mean, let's say, for example, you come into an art gallery and the painter who owns the gallery, all he sells is his own paintings, and they're all naturalistic paintings of ducks and birds and or deer and etc. And you come in, you say, I like a Jackson Pollock style painting. You know, it's exactly the same. Can you force him because he's a painter to take out 10 colors of paint and splatter a canvas with it and say, there you go? Or can he just say, I'm sorry, I don't offer that kind of nonsense. I
I
offer.
think, as a matter of fact, that's how the case resolved itself in the United States with the cake, was that it was considered his art. Wasn't there some aspect to that?
I don't recall the
Mm.
specifics of any one case, but that's it. I mean, it's one thing to say, I've got things for sale to the general public, therefore the general public should be able to buy them without racism, sexism, etc., homophobia, what have you. It's another thing to say, I'd like something custom made by you. I mean, think of it like Rourke in The Fountainhead, if you want to speak about Ayn Rand. It's not as though someone could walk into his office and say, I'd like you to build one of these things with balconies on it and, the Peter Keating style of house. It's not as though he was under any obligation to do so, nor should he be under an obligation to do so. But if he says, open to the general public, you design it, I'll make it, he can't then say, oh, but you're gay, but I won't do it for you. At least the police are not going to help him in getting the people out of his building.
Interestingly enough, in the novel, I think he ended up designing a church, didn't he? But it was not, it didn't have the usual spire. It didn't look like a church. It was low to
Yeah.
the ground. And the people who commissioned him to do it didn't like it.
Yeah. It was a sort of a church of man in the sense that it wasn't religious in nature. It was just to inspire a love of the natural beauty of humanity and its rational spirit, and et cetera. And it was captured by the sculptor in that book as well. I can't remember the sculptor's name, but that character. But yeah, they ultimately I think they ravished the thing, didn't they? Didn't they just take it apart and turn it into something? Oh, they turned it into a school for mentally challenged children, I think. That which was designed as a place to revere human intellect and reason was turned into the exact opposite in order to destroy the very purpose of the building.
What I hope that people who are listening to this understand is that the book is so valuable because you can take any example from politics, this is where it leads, politics. You can take any example, baking a cake or being forced to do that, or racism or war or any of these things, your rights, and examine them in meticulous detail based on the first person perspective. And when you do that, you make end up with a decision that you would not have come to had you had just followed your feelings.
I'll give
As
you an
Ayn Rand would
example.
have said, the squirtings of your organs.
That's right. And I'll give you an example of that. There's one chapter where I'm talking about two cases in the same chapter, and they involve a company that makes uh, a vaccine for the Bologna virus.
I love that, Paul Bologna. Jeanette and I laughed out loud when I said it.
And there's another case for the same chapter in which a physician refuses to administer the vaccine. And the question is that Vaccino Royale, who manufactures the vaccine, says it's safe and effective because we tested it on 1,000 people and none of them got, uh, you know, sick from it. And the question is, well, is that a basis for knowing, making a generalization about the safety or effectiveness of a vaccine, for example? In other words, what is a warranted method of induction?
Yes.
And
That was the chapter on induction.
yeah,
And you go right into the detail of what does you mean by safe? What do you mean by effective? Is 1,000 out of 1,000? Can you declare now that it's safe or not?
yeah,
You know, I don't want to
yeah.
give away the decision because that was actually a very entertaining chapter.
I won't give it away. I'll simply say that for anybody who knows me, I was opposed to basically every measure that came out during the pandemic. Uh, for completely academic reasons, the answers I give at the end of that chapter are not what you would expect me to give, but they're completely and utterly principled. And I do give a caveat, so that will help people with it. Uh, there's this, saying, how could McKeever come to that conclusion? Well, this is how, but don't worry about it. I haven't changed my spots.
That's the whole thing is that it explains how and why.
Yeah,
The rational process has been over the last 2,500 years or so in Western thought at least, been so muddled and such a mix, like I described it before, a Gordian knot. It's almost as if we cannot untangle ourselves from the fundamental philosophy and culture that we've grown up into, um, and extract out all of the good parts that when we apply reason to it, and from the first person perspective, then we can move on, I hope, from here. I would have thought we would have moved on from Ayn Rand's objectivism, but we have not. We always continue. It takes a huge cultural shift and it has to permeate the education system and especially the universities to have a cultural and a lasting cultural effect. And I hope that well, you can get this in libraries, can you, Paul?
if someone would like to put one in a library, that would be great. But I'll tell you, if you're a real cheapskate, don't worry. I'm not looking to make any money off of this. Okay, this is not the purpose of the book. I didn't write a book so as to make money. At the
I
same time,
just want the maximum number of people to read this book.
that's right. So if you go to Google Books, it's also available on Google Books. You can buy it through Google Books. But The compromise that any author makes when they make their work available on Google Books is that you have to make a portion of the book available for free. And so you can literally read, I think it's the first two chapters of my book, maybe more, on Google Books for free. And I'm happy, to have people do that. And hopefully they'll see the merit in getting the book in any way they can, whether it's very much more affordable as a Kindle book. I should just say about that. This is what they call a Kindle reader. It's just a physical device for reading Kindle files, but you don't need a reader to read Kindle files. You can get free apps for your phone. You can put them on your desktop. You can there's no need to buy any hardware. And the Kindle version of the book is, I forget what it is, like $24 or something like that. So it's regular book price because of the fact that there wasn't that $70 printing cost and et cetera. And I think the Audible version is about the same price. So it's accessible. It's not an exceptional cost unless you want to buy the print version. And as I say, I'm going to work on getting that into a format that's more affordable.
I highly recommend if people want to get into it, and people commute a lot. I used to commute a lot, and I've read. I think I have my Kindle library has over 150 books that I've read in there. Read, and if you're a commuter, this is a 24-hour long Audible book. It'll keep you thinking and entertained on your commute. So if you're a commuter, please, I would highly recommend getting the Audible, at least the Audible version of this. And if you enjoy it, I would then suggest that you get the hard, the physical book so that you have it in your library and pass it on to people. Let people know that this exists because it is a fundamental shift, I think, in the way that we should or ought to act in the future regarding politics and freedom. Paul McKeever, thank you very much for writing the book. Can we expect anything else coming from your pen in the near future?
Well, I'll just say that I'm pondering also releasing individual chapters with a short catch-up chapter prior to the existing chapters, so that those who are just interested in one topic, maybe you're not interested in freedom, maybe you're interested in free will though. And what I've pondered is the possibility of putting out, say, just the free will chapter, but with very much shortened just the conclusions from the preceding chapters so that you're not misunderstanding what I say. I'm going to have to look at it and see whether it's going to be misleading as a result. If so, I will not put it out. I'll just leave the full book out. And the other possibility is to put out the three books separately so that those who want to just take their time or want to have hardbound editions, it wasn't possible to do a hardbound for this. It's just too long, too many pages. But I've been thinking about putting out the books 1 and 2 possibly as a single volume, and then book 3 as another volume so that people can have hardcovers on their bookshelf. They're easier to handle too. If you've tried to handle a book that's as thick as this one, it can be a bit unwieldy when it's sitting on your lap. Um, but I think if it were split in two, that might be something people would enjoy. So,
Well, I look forward to any way that you can help disseminate the ideas in the book, Paul. Thank you very much for writing it, and thank you for joining me today.
well, thank you, Robert.